The fact is, these movies made us feel with paint and pixels and often years of incredible hard work and effort. It is no surprise that animation is Hollywood's most successful and innovative genre.
Well, he's got a point. Now more than ever, animation has become a major money-making business. Seriously, every year you'd always find at least one animated film to be among the top 10 highest-grossing movies, or even in the top 5. Not only are they capable of producing features that can easily make $1 billion worldwide, but some can also end up becoming the most successful movie of their respective year. However, just because you made an animated feature, that doesn't mean it's gonna immediately become a hit. They're actually a huge risk. Sure, at best, they can bring out some big rewards, but when they fall, they can turn into a disaster, resulting in some massively consequential results. Trust me when I say that the last thing you want for an animated feature is to be a box office bomb. Now for this top 10, I'm not the one who will be organizing the list. This will be entirely determined by the amount these movies lost for their respective studio. So the bigger the number, the higher they'll be on the list. Oh, and if your favorite film ends up here and you get upset, well, don't blame me. Blame the numbers and the people who didn't see it at the time. I'm Animat, and these are the top 10 biggest animated box office bombs!
I'm gonna explode an atom bomb. In your soul. I'm gonna explode an atom bomb. In your soul.
Now let's start things off with not one, but two very similar box office bombs. Yes, folks, it's a 2014 double whammy from DreamWorks Animation. Okay, for real though, 2014 was one of DreamWorks' worst years that really took down the company. Sure, it was the time when How to Train Your Dragon 2 came out as a big hit, but even that wasn't enough to save it from the failures of both films that Hiccup and Toothless got stuck in the middle with. First, there was Mr. Peabody and Sherman, based on the classic Rocky and Bullwinkle characters created by Ted Key. And the other was the spin-off to one of their most successful franchises, Penguins of Madagascar. Now, both films did pretty well in hindsight. They both got some decent reviews from critics, and they even got some good numbers at the box office. So, what went wrong? Well, the fact that only a small fraction of those numbers came domestically could be one, but the biggest culprit would be that the budgets for both were way too big. Peabody came in with a price of $145 million, while the Penguins would have a price of $132 million. As a result, they both didn't do enough to turn a profit for the studio, and DreamWorks would end up putting a write-down of $57 million each, leaving the company mostly stranded out in the cold.
Well, this sucks.
After the flops, DreamWorks would go through their biggest downgrade in the company's history. Not only would they have to go and change some new heads, but they would also go and shut down their entire Redwood division that would cost them 500 employees. You see, that's the thing with these box office bombs. Yeah, sure, as fun as they are to watch, they do have some serious consequential results, and you might want to have some second thoughts before you want to go and set off another.
He's in trouble! Stand down, soldier.
Did somebody say kaboom? Yes, I know that joke has been overused for a bit, but I just want to say that as a Muppet fan, I've always wanted to do that.
I'm gonna light some dynamite. And open your heart.
On the outside, Bill Murray is a great actor, but on the inside, he is a money-losing disaster. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not saying that Bill Murray is a terrible human being at all. I am not saying that. What I mean is that the inside of Bill Murray is literally the location of our next bomb.
My name is Ozzy? What? My name is
Jones.
Who? My name is Osmosis Jones.
Debatably, this could be one of those movies that would cause audiences and critics to have the most mixed reactions. Like, never would one film contain elements that people really loved and others that people really hated at the same time. However, it's not necessarily the movie's own fault that people didn't want to go see a buddy cop movie set inside the human body. You see, during the late 1990s and early 2000s, Warner Brothers was in their worst shape when it came to handling animated features. With the exception of Space Jam, every animated movie they released was poorly marketed, given little to no public exposure, and would end up losing money for the studio. Regardless if they would be passed off as crap like Quest for Camelot, or praised as cinematic masterpieces like The Iron Giant, it was like if animated features were a curse for the Warners, and they simply had no clue what to do with them. In the case of Osmosis Jones, this was one where they lost the most money, and the numbers are there to prove it. With a budget of $70 million, the film only made a box office total of $14 million, and, according to calculations, that would mean Warner Brothers lost around $63 million.
Now, before I continue, I just would like to emphasize that what I have mentioned is not the definitive amount that Warner Brothers lost for Osmosis Jones. What I've said is only based on estimated calculations alone. It could be more, it could be less. However, even though there isn't any legitimate reports that would state on how much Warner Brothers actually lost for Osmosis Jones, I can say with certainty, by just looking at the numbers alone, that Warner Brothers did lose, at minimum, $60 million. And you know what? It really did suck, because all that just for a pretty creative way of mixing live action and animation with a unique style in terms of how they would interact with one another.
Think about it overnight.
Then again, maybe a movie about cartoon characters messing with Bill Murray's body isn't really an appealing idea after all.
I'm gonna light some dynamite and blow open your heart.
Okay, admittedly, I could be cheating on this one because this isn't necessarily a fully animated feature. Like, for the most part, this is actually a live-action animation hybrid, and maybe a little bit more emphasis on the former. But then again, so was Osmosis Jones, so let's blow the monkey!
We all remember Henry Selick as one of the masters of stop motion by directing such films as The Nightmare Before Christmas and James and the Giant Peach. But with all directors, you would always find at least that one movie in their filmography that can often be viewed as the bad one. And in this case, it's his 2001 dark comedy, Monkey Bone. Based on the comic book, Darktown, it was meant to show Henry's more wild and crazy side that he wouldn't normally present in his family films, with Brendan Fraser and a stop-motion monkey leading the madness. However, it could be possible that it was a little too wild for the crowd. Not only were critics unamused despite the cool-looking visuals, but it also failed even harder to have audiences go downtown. Now, this wasn't a cheap movie to make. With all the crazy effects, weird sets, animation, and notable stars to be in the feature, it had a pretty big budget of $75 million. But since it only made around a tenth of that at the box office, it would end up becoming a bomb that blew off more than $70 million.
Funny enough, this movie would often be compared to Ralph Bakshi's Cool World. Not only with the way that both films would mix live action and animation, and that they both have a very similar plot, but also how both films flopped at the box office and that both directors of those films wouldn't make another animated feature for years to come. But thankfully, in the case of Selick, he would actually return to make an animated feature 8 years later, and that it would actually become a success with Coraline. So it is safe to say that Henry did move on from the failure of Monkey Bone so that he can get back to be on top of his game. Wait a minute. Is that? Oh my god, Monkey Bone is spreading! It's coming to affect us all! Well, it is the other world, so it's probably for the best. Wait, Coraline wasn't in there, was she?
I'm gonna light some dynamite and blow open your heart.
Nobody is safe from making a box office bomb. Not even Disney.
Sure, Disney is known to be the most beloved animation studio of all time, but throughout their long legacy, there have been a few of the company's films that actually made them lose money. Believe it or not, even some of their most legendary movies like Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Sleeping Beauty were flops when they first appeared in theaters. However, if you were looking for a real bomb, then you'd have to open a map to find Disney's most infamous failure.
Treasure Planet? No.
Yes, what was originally a passion project for the directing duo John Musker and Ron Clements by giving a sci-fi twist to the classic Robert Louis Stevenson novel turned out to be a sinking ship. I'll give it that it was quite an ambitious project, especially with a $140 million budget, but by the time it came out in theaters, it only grabbed just a handful of the loot with $38 million domestically and a worldwide total of $110 million. Now, looking at the numbers alone is one way of knowing that it tanked, but reports came out saying that the film ultimately resulted Disney to take a $74 million pre-tax write-down.
As a result, Treasure Planet would become the most prominent example of how Disney animation was such in terrible shape during the 2000 decade. And you know the saddest part about this? Is that they actually had some high hopes for it as well, with plans in order to expand the Treasure Planet universe with a TV series and a direct-to-video sequel. But just when Disney thought that they made it to the treasure, they accidentally pressed one wrong button and it all went... Where's the kaboom? There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom! Oh. There it is.
I'm gonna light some dynamite and blow open your heart.
And if you thought Disney's disaster was bad, wait till you see how Pixar ended up with a box office bomb.
Out of all the big animation studios, you wouldn't expect Pixar to have a movie that flopped, especially when they're still regarded as the kings of animation by making some of the most highly praised and highest grossing animated films. For the most part, they've been very consistent when it comes to releasing successful hit after successful hit. That is, except for one.
What?
Right from the start, The Good Dinosaur had been causing nothing but trouble for the studio. Numerous of delays, never-ending problems with the story, and even a Brave-style leadership switch where the directing role went from the movie's creator Bob Peterson to Peter Sohn, all plagued the production that presented a looming sign of what would be to come. And by the time the film finally came out, it was the first time that audiences didn't really feel like checking out a Pixar movie, and it would be for many reasons. People were more interested in checking out the final Hunger Games movie, they already had their Pixar fill of the year with Inside Out, the characters look more like they belong in the Flintstones more than in a Pixar movie, and the reviews aren't as strong as the other films from the studio. Add in the ridiculously huge budget of $175 million, it ultimately led The Good Dinosaur to not only be Pixar's lowest grossing movie to date, but to also make the company lose around $85 million.
It really was a wake-up call for the studio to realize that they are not invincible, especially when they released this in November for the first time in more than a decade. When they tried to do that again in 2017 with Coco, they wanted to make sure that this mistake would not happen again by putting up a 21-minute long Frozen short. In the end, the fate of the movie pretty much met the same as Arlo's dad. Like so. Okay, yes, I know it really didn't sound like much, and it was really weak compared to the other ones that I did, but look at what it did. Alright, watch this, watch this, watch this, watch this! Oh, snap, man! That was like a home run hit right there!
I'm gonna light some dynamite. Open your heart.
You know, for a team that calls themselves the Guardians of Childhood, they didn't really do a good job guarding DreamWorks from having this nightmare.
In an age where movies are dominated by big crossovers and cinematic universes, you'd think that Rise of the Guardians would be set to become DreamWorks' next big hit. I mean, you got this Avengers-style movie where childhood legends like Santa, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, the Sandman, and Jack Frost all come together in order to fight the Boogeyman. If you ask me, that sounds pretty awesome.
Oh, good. That was my idea.
However, at the time, it didn't seem to be enough to lure audiences in for the adventure. Sure, the studio put in quite a lot to make the film as spectacular as it can with a $145 million budget, but its November release was what ultimately led to its biggest downfall. Not only did people already had their animated fill with Wreck-It Ralph, but the movie was up against some serious big-name competition, including Skyfall, Spielberg's Lincoln, and especially the final Twilight film. As a result, the movie only made a total of $307 million at the box office, with a little more than $103 million that came domestically, which led the company to have an $87 million write-down.
Consequentially, this would also be the straw that broke DreamWorks' back. Now, beforehand, they were able to go and release hit after hit, like they were in their strongest shape possible. But then Guardians came in, and that's when things start to really crumble down and have a domino effect where it would result in more flops and more layoffs, like with Turbo and the already mentioned Peabody and Sherman and Penguins of Madagascar. But on the bright side, this movie would actually go on and gain a massive cult following, where Jack Frost and Tooth Fairy cosplays were really commonplace at conventions, and all the fan art. So much fan art. So much fan art of Jack Frost making out with Elsa. Oh, good God! Why do we have to give such amazing artistic skills to hopeless romantics? I mean, isn't the subject of Elsa and a relationship already a huge debate in the first place? Well, if that is the case, well, better be safe than sorry. Shippings. Am I right?
I'm gonna light some dynamite. Open your heart.
How ironic that one of the biggest box office bombs would actually come from one of the biggest video game franchises.
If you're interested in gaming, then there's a very good chance that you might have played at least one Final Fantasy game. Even if you haven't, then you most certainly have heard about it along with its massive impact in the industry, on top of even stumbling upon some of its characters in other games like in Kingdom Hearts or Super Smash Bros. But then, in the late 1990s, the company that would make these games, Square, decided to expand their creative horizons with a movie studio called Square Pictures, and would pursue to make the first ever photorealistic computer animated feature. Now, Square tried all they can to make this as ambitious as possible by pouring in $137 million onto its budget. An all-star cast, the most advanced technology of its time for the highest quality rendering, even having Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi to be in charge of the project. Square equipped this with everything they've got, but by the time the movie came out in 2001, the box office was just too strong of a boss for it to conquer. It was already bad enough that the infamous reputation of films based on video games made audiences feel iffy about this one, but it also ended up making less than its budget with just $85 million, resulting the company to lose $94 million.
Unsurprisingly, this would end up becoming the only movie from Square Pictures, as the company did shut down after the failure of Spirits Within. But interestingly enough, this would not end up becoming the only CG Final Fantasy film. Years later, there would be a few more movies that would appear that would have a similar goal, and to go and expand the Final Fantasy franchise with Advent Children and Kingsglaive. However, even though this did become a major flop, it did not go unnoticed in terms of its ambition, as it still remains as one of the most photorealistic movies ever created. Oh my, See, that's the thing with technology. Even if you had the most advanced computers back in like 2001, time will never be kind to it, and eventually, your movie will just end up looking dated no matter what. That is exactly why I prefer using technology like this, where it is so simple, it's pretty much timeless. Oh, finally! Ah, man. Ah, sweet. Seriously. Like, all that farming I've done finally paid off here.
I'm gonna light some dynamite and blow open your heart.
Now, I know that we're not in Kansas anymore, because if we were, we wouldn't have seen this much money melt as quick as a witch.
What story can be more iconic than The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum? Especially when it gave us one of the most legendary movies ever made. Naturally, this would result in several different adaptations and all sorts of follow-ups and spin-offs that try to expand the story of Oz. One of them, however, would end up becoming infamous for being more disastrous than a Kansas tornado, and that would be the 2014 animated feature, Legend of Oz: Dorothy's Return. One important thing to note about this feature is that despite getting a major release in over 2,600 theaters, this was actually an entirely independent production that was built and funded unlike any other animated film. There was no big studio behind it that gave the production millions of dollars. It was all through years of accumulating investors who would be willing to spend thousands of dollars each on stocks and shares in the promise that this would be the next big animated franchise. And yes, they were planning a whole franchise out of it with sequels, video games, and a TV show. However, by the time the film was released, those plans immediately broke into pieces. It barely even left a dent at the box office, where it only made a total of less than $19 million on a $70 million budget. Now, you'd think that would mean that this movie would have a loss of up to $70 million, right? No! Keep in mind that I said that these investors were putting their money on a franchise. That $70 million was just on the movie alone, and that's exactly why reports would come out stating that investors have lost an accumulative total of up to $100 million.
Honestly, the more you look into the financing of this film, the more you realize how totally insane everything is. Seriously, the guys who were in charge of this project actually have a very large history of shady practices in order to have investors to go and fund their movie, including this one, and would also end up getting cease and desist letters in several states. Heck, one of the people who are in charge of actually going around and fundraise the project is actually nothing more but a coffee shop owner. And when the movie bombed, nothing else came out of it ever since. Like, no promise of a whole franchise, it's now just that movie alone. Don't you guys see what's happening here? This isn't just a flop. This is a full-on scam. All in the promise to make Wizard of Oz look like this.
Hello, Dorothy. And Toto.
Holy crap, what the fridge is that?
All hail the jester, the generous jester of Oz!
Oh God! Oh God! Oh God! Ah! 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 Wait a minute, what the fridge am I doing? I have a box that can literally explode anything that I want.
Welcome to the jester.
Whew! At least now the movie knows how the investors felt.
I'm gonna light some dynamite and blow open your heart.
Have you ever imagine a bomb so big that it could pretty much blow up an entire planet? Not only did that happen in this film, but a bomb of that magnitude also happened to this film.
For some people, the failure of Titan AE would be a bit perplexing, since it now has a small cult following with some pretty devoted fans. But once you get into the history of the project, you'll discover that it was hopeless from the very beginning. Many writers have tried and failed to develop a cohesive story with it until 20th Century Fox handed the script over to Don Bluth and Gary Goldman, who aren't really sci-fi people outside of that one game they did, but they took it anyways because at least the animators would have something to work on. But even with that in production, and having a budget of somewhere between $75 and $90 million, it still wouldn't stop Fox's animation studio from becoming completely broken, which even led to more than 300 animators getting laid off while Titan AE was still in development. But that bomb wouldn't fully ignite until it was released in the middle of 2000, where it didn't even make half of its budget with less than $37 million, and ended up with one of Fox's biggest disasters that cost them $100 million. Now, I know some people might say that this should have been tied with Legend of Oz because they both lost the same amount, but keep in mind that Titan AE was released in 2000. So when you adjust that for inflation, 100 mil meant a lot more back then than it does now.
When Titan AE bombed, it not only indicated that the movie itself would be a major flop, but also the entire animation studio as well. Like I said before, they were already getting rid of people while they were still making it, and the studio ultimately shut down just 10 days after the movie's release. And what's more, it was also stated to be a major factor as to how Bill Mechanic ultimately got kicked out of being the chairman of Fox. And it's honestly really crazy to think about because this movie honestly made more damage to the company more so than any other movie that they have made. And all this just because Fox was just so desperate to make another sci-fi movie. But let's be real though. Can you guys really blame them? I mean, they really didn't have much movies of the genre at the time. Except for Alien, and Predator, and Planet of the Apes, and The Day the Earth Stood Still, and Independence Day. And they also had all the Star Wars movies at the time. Okay, seriously, did nobody ever stop and think if Titan AE was really that necessary? I mean, if there was someone out there who actually asked that question at the time, they would have probably saved themselves from... Now, before we go and set off the biggest bomb of them all, I would like to have an honorable mention. I'm not gonna lie, I honestly put this one in the honorable mention because I know that there are gonna be some people that will point to this as the biggest bomb of them all. However, when looking deep into my research, I felt like there was just something that didn't necessarily seem right. Like, I'm not gonna deny, yes, it really was a major flop, but I don't think it really was as big of a bomb as...
These joints were from the Jasmine Sea! That's halfway around the world!
Then we better get started.
I might as well be direct with this one. Yes, Sinbad Legend of the Seven Seas is the notorious movie that is not only noted to be DreamWorks' biggest box office bomb, but also the main reason why they've never made another hand-drawn animated film since. In fact, when you go on Wikipedia's list of the biggest box office bombs, you'll find that Sinbad sits right on top as the biggest loser that made DreamWorks lost a definitive total of $125 million, using an article from the Los Angeles Times as its source stating, "The company nearly went bankrupt twice," David Geffen said during a panel discussion in New York in 2005. Adding that when the animated film Sinbad Legend of the Seven Seas flopped in 2003, the resulting $125 million loss nearly sank the company.
Now, I am not saying that Wikipedia is spreading false information here. I'm sure that DreamWorks Animation did actually lose a lot of money, and even that amount during that time. But here's the part where it doesn't necessarily make sense. Because when you look at the movie's budget and how much it did at the box office, something doesn't seem right. Something just doesn't click to that $125 million loss. Because here's the thing. The budget of Sinbad was only $60 million. And how much it made at the box office in total was actually $80 million. Now, of course, this does not mean that it's a hit. But through those calculations alone, it doesn't make sense that the movie would end up losing more than double its budget alone. Now, what I am trying to say here, it's not that DreamWorks Animation did not lose $125 million because of Sinbad. What I am trying to say is that DreamWorks Animation did not lose $125 million on Sinbad alone.
You see, before they split in 2004, DreamWorks Animation and DreamWorks Pictures were both under the same umbrella, and 2003 was certainly a terrible year for them. Not only did they have to deal with Sinbad's failure, but several of their films flopped as well, like Biker Boys, Head of State, and the horrifying Cat in the Hat. When taking all these movies into account and the amount they've lost, it would make a lot more sense that they would all work together to give DreamWorks that $125 million loss.
Of course, Sinbad could be the most notable of them all because this film did leave a massive impact in terms of how DreamWorks would then go on to create their animated films. That, and also because it is possible that it's the one that lost the most money among all of them. That's why we see the sailor as the mascot of the DreamWorks bombs. You see, this is exactly why I put Sinbad in the honorable mentions. There's no legitimate report that stated on how much this movie alone lost DreamWorks. That, and when you looked at that LA Times source, David Geffen was actually pretty vague in terms of what he was trying to say during that time. But look, here's the thing. Maybe I am wrong about what I'm saying, and maybe Sinbad actually did lose DreamWorks $125 million. But since there is no further evidence or legitimate proof of that, that's why I put this in the honorable mention more for the sake of being safe for this list. There isn't a full legitimate report if we know that Sinbad really did lose that amount of money, or if it's the combination of all those other films that made DreamWorks lost $125 million. But either way, it is worth mentioning because this is the film that made Hand Drawn go.
It's a shame it'll never get.
I'm gonna get through you, baby, before I lose control!
You know, it's actually kind of funny how I use that clip of John Carter as the segue to the #1 spot. Because that and the one I'll be talking about both actually have a lot in common. Now, of course, they're both two of the biggest box office bombs of all time. They're both released by Disney. They're both just released a year apart from each other. And they are both set on Mars. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the biggest box office bomb of them all. Mars Needs Bombs!
Out of all the animated features out there, there is no bomb that can be bigger than Mars Needs Moms. I mean, we're talking about a bomb that is out of this world because #2 already blew up this world. Now, you don't have to look far to figure out why this ended up as a complete disaster. In fact, all you have to do is just look at the movie. It's downright hideous. Not even that thick alien booty was alluring enough to have audiences watch this for like 80 minutes. You know when the animation is bad when the humans look more like Martians than the Martians themselves. Yes, I know, that sounds very subjective of me to say, but honestly, you can't tell me that's not what made this fail. Many sources will tell you that the terrible use of motion capture is what caused audiences to step away from the movie, on top of the unappealingly mixed reviews and the stupidly large budget of $150 million. The movie would go on to fall right down to the bottom of the trash heap at the box office and only make a total of $39 million. As a result, reports would vary on how much this movie would ultimately cost Disney, but they all indicated that some huge numbers were lost, ranging from $100 million all the way up to $144 million.
As the bomb would explode, it would also go and destroy everything in its path. It's not just Disney's money, but also the use of motion capture as a legitimate storytelling medium for computer animated films. Now, I don't know if you have noticed, but with the exception of The Adventures of Tintin, there hasn't been another motion capture movie ever since, like an animated film that would use motion capture and all that kind of stuff. But what's more, Marsney's moms would also lead the movie to go and shut down the studio behind it, Image Movers Digital, along with all of its potential projects that they wanted to do afterwards, which includes a Nutcracker movie, a Roger Rabbit sequel, and also a computer animated remake of the Beatles' Yellow Submarine. Which its cancellation is probably for the best. So, in short, this bomb blew up a lot of Disney's money. It blew up Image Movers Digital. It blew up all its future projects. It blew up motion capture as a computer animation medium. And it blew up this whole top 10.
I'm gonna explode an atom bomb in your soul. I'm gonna explode an atom bomb in your soul. I'm gonna get through you, baby, before I lose control. With every trick in sight. I know I'm gonna make you happy, baby. I'm gonna light some dynamite and open your heart.
Don't worry, buddy, I got you.
I pushed the wrong one.
Oh my God!